Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. Forget the gowns, forget the beheadings, forget Henry VIII's 6 wives for just a moment. Because tonight we're diving into something most people never talk about. The technology, the machines, the absolutely unhinged inventions that the Tudors built to survive, impress, and occasionally murder each other. Before we get started, go ahead and like the video if you're into this. Subscribe if you want more weird historical deep dives. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? I love seeing the night owls and insomniacs gathering from every corner of the world. Now, get comfortable. Dim those lights. Maybe grab some tea. Turn on a fan for that white noise. Because we're about to spend the next hour and a half exploring flush toilets that announced your bathroom habits to the entire palace. Astronomical clocks that could predict when you'd die, printing presses that started wars, guns that exploded in your hands, and medical devices that were absolutely just torture equipment with paperwork. This is going to be a journey, so settle in. In 1596, a courtier named Sir John Harrington invented the first flushing toilet for Queen Elizabeth I. It had levers, valves, a water cistern, complex engineering. It actually worked. Elizabeth was so impressed she had one installed at Richmond Palace, but nobody tells you what happened next. That toilet, when it flushed, roared like a waterfall. The sound echoed through stone corridors. Every courtier, every servant, every person within earshot knew exactly when someone was using it. So embarrassing that Elizabeth, the most powerful woman in England, barely touched it. She went right back to using a close stool. A padded box with a chamber pot inside. Portable, silent, dignified. And that's just the beginning. That one failed toilet tells you everything about Tudor technology. Brilliant, innovative, absolutely impractical. Because the Tudors weren't building things for convenience, they were building them for power, for spectacle, for survival in a world where a common cold could kill you, and insulting the wrong person meant your head on a spike. Tonight, you're going to see astronomical clocks that tracked your death date, navigational tools that blinded sailors, guns that murdered their own users, cosmetics that poisoned queens, corsets that crushed organs, ships that leaked like sieves, and medical equipment that was definitely, absolutely, just torture with a permission slip. The Tudors weren't primitive, they were terrifying, brilliant, completely out of their minds, and they built technology that matched. There's a clock at Hampton Court Palace. If you visit today, walk into the main courtyard and look up. You'll see it. Massive, astronomical, still ticking after nearly 500 years. Gold and blue and impossibly complex. Built in 1540, and it was designed to do something most clocks don't do. Tell you when the universe was going to kill you. This wasn't just a clock, it was a statement. Henry VIII commissioned it during his marriage to Anne of Cleves, and he wanted something that would make every visitor to Hampton Court stop dead in their tracks and remember exactly who had the power here. The clock doesn't just tell time, it shows the hour, the date, the month, the phases of the moon, the position of the sun in the zodiac, the time of high tide at London Bridge, which was crucial because the Thames was the highway of Tudor London, and if you mistimed your boat ride, you could end up smashed against the bridge supports and very, very dead. But here's where it gets weird. The clock also calculated the movements of the planets, all of them, according to Ptolemaic astronomy, which placed Earth at the centre of the universe, with everything else spinning around it in perfect crystalline spheres. Wrong, obviously, but in 1540, if you suggested otherwise, you could be accused of heresy. Copernicus had just published his theory that the sun was at the centre, but it hadn't caught on yet. The church still insisted that Earth was the centre of God's creation, and questioning that was dangerous. So the Hampton Court clock embodied the entire cosmic order as the Tudors understood it. Earth, unmoving, central, with the sun, moon and planets dancing around it in careful mathematical precision. And if you knew how to read it, if you understood astrology, which every educated person did, you could predict the future. When to plant crops, when to wage war, when to get married, when to have surgery, when to stay in bed and pray because the stars were aligned against you. People forget this about the Tudor period. Astrology wasn't superstition, it was science. The best minds of the age, mathematicians, physicians, navigators, all believed that the movements of celestial bodies directly affected events on Earth. Your health, your fortune, your lifespan. Queen Elizabeth I had a court astrologer, John Dee, a brilliant mathematician who calculated the most auspicious date for her coronation based on the alignment of the planets. She wouldn't be crowned until he gave the go-ahead. That's how seriously they took this. So the Hampton Court clock wasn't just showing off. It was a tool, a way to read the universe, to know when to act and when to wait, to understand the hidden forces shaping your life. And here's the truly wild part. The clock was right. Not about astrology, obviously, but about tides, about lunar cycles, about the mathematical relationships between celestial movements. The craftsman who built this thing understood spherical geometry, gear ratios, and mechanical engineering at a level that wouldn't be surpassed for another century. They built a computer, an analog computer made of brass and iron and obsessive precision, and it's still running. The clockmaker was Nicholas Ursian, a Bavarian astronomer and mechanic brought to England, specifically for this project. He spent years designing it, calculating the gear ratios needed to make the planets move at the correct speeds relative to each other, building mechanisms that could track the 29.5-day lunar cycle and the 365.25-day solar year simultaneously. It's a masterpiece, and it was built by a civilization that didn't have electricity, didn't have computers, didn't even have accurate star charts, just math, metalwork, and an obsessive need to control time itself. Because that's what the Tudors were obsessed with, control. They couldn't control plague, couldn't control famine, couldn't control whether your wife would give you a son or another disappointing daughter. But they could build a clock that turned the cosmos into something you could track, measure, predict. The Hampton Court clock was magic, not literally, but close enough. It took the chaos of existence and turned it into ticking, predictable order. And in a world where death could come at any moment, from disease, from violence, from a badly timed boat ride, that illusion of control was worth more than gold. While Henry VIII was commissioning clocks to track the cosmos, his sailors were dying at sea, blind, lost, drowning thousands of miles from home, because measuring the heavens was one thing. Measuring the earth while standing on a pitching ship in the middle of an ocean, that required different magic entirely. The Delight went down off the coast of Newfoundland in 1595, all hands lost, every sailor, every officer, including a navigator who'd been carrying something more valuable than any cargo in the hold. Not gold, not jewels, a backstaff. Never heard of it? Neither had most people. But this instrument, and others like it, were the reason the Tudors went from a minor island kingdom to a global empire. Because the Tudors didn't conquer the world with swords. They conquered it with math. Let's talk about navigation. In the Tudor period, if you wanted to sail anywhere beyond the sight of land, you needed to know three things. Your latitude, how far north or south you were. Your longitude, how far east or west. And your direction. Direction was easy. You had a compass, a magnetized needle floating in water or balanced on a pin, always pointing north. The Tudors didn't invent the compass, but they perfected it. They mounted compasses in gimbals, rings that let the compass stay level, even when the ship was pitching in heavy seas. They marked compass cards with 32 points instead of just 4, giving navigators precise bearings. But latitude, that was harder. To know how far north you were, you needed to measure the angle of the sun at noon, or the angle of the North Star at night. And to do that, you needed instruments. Enter the astrolabe, a flat brass disc covered in intricate engravings and rotating parts. It looked like something a wizard would use. And in a way, navigators were wizards. They could look at a metal disc, sight the sun through a ormuhue, movable arm, read a number, and tell you exactly how far you were from the equator. It was brilliant. It was also incredibly difficult to use on a ship, because ships move, they pitch, they roll, they yaw, and if you're trying to sight the sun through a tiny hole while the deck is lurching beneath your feet, and you're probably seasick, good luck getting an accurate reading. So Tudor navigators invented something better, the cross staff, a long wooden pole with a sliding crosspiece. You'd hold the pole up to your eye, slide the crosspiece until it framed the horizon and the sun simultaneously, and read the angle off the markings. Simpler, more accurate. Except for one tiny problem. You had to stare directly at the sun, while it burned your retinas, while you slowly went blind. Tudor sailors didn't complain. Going blind was just part of the job, like scurvy, like storms, like the very real possibility that you'd sail off the edge of the map and never come home. But then someone had a brilliant idea. What if you didn't look at the sun? What if you stood with your back to it and measured its shadow instead? The backstaff was born. Invented by John Davis in 1594. You'd point one end at the horizon, adjust the sliding piece until the sun's shadow lined up with the sight, and read your latitude without ever looking at the sun. Revolutionary. Game-changing. The kind of invention that seems obvious in retrospect but took a special kind of genius to figure out. John Davis was that genius. He was an explorer, a navigator, and a privateer, which is a polite word for pirate with government permission. He sailed to the Arctic 3 times trying to find the Northwest Passage. Never found it. But he did map huge sections of the North American coast and invented the single most important navigational instrument of the age. The backstaff was so good that sailors used it for the next 150 years, until the sextant came along and made everything obsolete. But in the Tudor period, the backstaff was cutting-edge technology. It let sailors cross oceans with confidence, it let them return home, it let them draw maps, and maps were everything. Because longitude, figuring out how far east or west you were, was basically impossible. There was no good method, no reliable instrument. You had to guess based on your speed, your direction, and how long you'd been sailing. This was called dead reckoning, which is a comforting name for we have no idea where we are, but we're going to pretend we do. Ships got lost constantly. Entire fleets would vanish. The ocean was a black hole that swallowed men and ships and left no trace. But the Tudors kept sailing anyway, because the rewards were too great. Spices from the East Indies, gold from the Americas, new lands to claim and exploit and rename after English monarchs. Tudor navigators carried other tools too. The nocturnal, a device for telling time at night by measuring the rotation of stars around the North Star. The log and line, a rope with knots tied at regular intervals, thrown overboard to measure the ship's speed. The traverse board, a wooden board with holes and pegs used to track the ship's course throughout the day. These weren't just tools. They were survival equipment. Without them, you were dead, lost at sea, starved. Or worse, you'd sight land and think you were home, only to discover you'd sailed thousands of miles off course and were about to be greeted by very unfriendly locals who didn't appreciate surprise visitors. Tudor navigation technology worked, not perfectly, not reliably, but well enough that English ships sailed around the world. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe from 1577 to 1580, with a compass, an astrolabe, an absolute blind faith that his math was correct. He came home, with a ship full of Spanish gold, and Queen Elizabeth I knighted him on the deck of his ship, the Golden Hinder, because he'd just proven that England could go anywhere, do anything, and steal whatever wasn't nailed down. That's the power of technology. Not just the instruments themselves, but what they represented. Control over the unknown. The ability to venture into the void and come back alive. The Tudors didn't have GPS, didn't have satellites, didn't have weather forecasts, just brass and wood and math, and the absolute certainty that if you calculated the angles correctly, You could cross an ocean. They were wrong often. Ships sank, men died, entire expeditions vanished without a trace. But enough of them succeeded that the world changed forever. The Tudors went from being a minor European power to having colonies on 3 continents. And it all started with instruments that could measure angles. But those instruments did something else, something the Tudors didn't anticipate. They created demand for maps, for books, for printed knowledge that could be shared, copied, distributed. And there was one piece of technology that made that possible. One machine that would change England more than any ship or any clock ever could. William Caxton arrived in Westminster in 1476 with a wooden press, metal type, and a dangerous idea. He started printing books immediately. Not in Latin, in English. This doesn't sound revolutionary, but it was. Because before the printing press, books were copied by hand, by monks, who spent months or years painstakingly transcribing each page with quill and ink. One mistake, and you had to start over. Books were rare, expensive, owned almost exclusively by the church and the very wealthy, and most of them were in Latin, the language of scholars and priests, not the language of regular people. If you wanted to read the Bible, you needed to know Latin, which meant you needed education, which meant you needed money, which meant the church controlled who had access to God's word. The printing press changed everything. Suddenly, you could produce hundreds of copies of a book in the time it took a scribe to make one. Books became cheaper, more available, and people started printing in vernacular languages. English, German, French. The Catholic Church hated this, because once people could read the Bible in their own language, they started asking questions, dangerous questions, like why do we need priests as intermediaries? Why do we have to pay the church for forgiveness? Why does the Pope live in a palace while we're starving? The Protestant Reformation was born from a printing press. Martin Luther's 95 Theses were printed and distributed across Europe in a matter of weeks. Before the printing press, his ideas would have died in obscurity. After the printing press, they started a war that killed millions and split Christianity in half. In England, the printing press had a different but equally dramatic effect. It standardized the English language. Before printing, English was a mess. Every region had its own dialect. Spelling was a suggestion. Grammar was whatever felt right. There was no standard English, just a collection of regional variations that were sometimes mutually unintelligible. But printers needed consistency. They needed to decide how to spell words, what grammar rules to follow, which dialect to use as the standard. And the dialect they chose was London English, the language of the court, of commerce, of power. So the printing press didn't just spread literacy, it created a national language. It turned a fragmented collection of regional dialects into English, capital E, the language of Shakespeare, of the King James Bible, of global empire. But here's what most people don't know about Tudor printing presses. They were weapons, literally. Governments controlled them, censored them, destroyed them when they printed the wrong things. In 1530, Henry VIII banned the import of books printed abroad without royal approval. Why? Because people were smuggling in Protestant texts, Lutheran heresies, books that questioned the authority of the Catholic Church. And Henry, at this point still a faithful Catholic, wanted them stopped. But then Henry decided he wanted a divorce, and the Pope said no. And suddenly Henry needed Protestant arguments. He needed books that said the Pope wasn't infallible, that kings could govern their own churches, that royal authority came from God, not from Rome. So the same printing presses that had been printing Catholic propaganda started printing Protestant propaganda. Then, when Henry's daughter Mary I took the throne, they switched back to Catholic propaganda. Then, when Elizabeth I became queen, back to Protestants. The printing press was a weapon in a war of ideas, and people died over it. Protestant printers were burned at the stake under Mary. Catholic printers were hanged under Elizabeth, Possession of the wrong book could get you executed. But people kept printing, kept reading, kept thinking dangerous thoughts. Because once you've tasted literacy, once you've read words that challenge authority, you can't go back to ignorance. The printing press was the most dangerous technology the Tudors possessed, not because of what it printed, but because of what it represented. The democratization of knowledge. The idea that you didn't need a priest to interpret God's word for you, that you could read it yourself, think for yourself, decide for yourself what was true. That idea terrified the powerful, and it should have. Because within a century of the printing press arriving in England, the country would execute a king, would fight a civil war over the power of monarchs versus the power of parliament, would begin questioning every assumption about hierarchy and authority and divine right, all because of a machine that pressed ink onto paper. But while printers were starting intellectual revolutions with words, military engineers were starting actual revolutions with something far more immediate, far more visceral, something that could end a life in an instant if it worked, or end yours if it didn't. The Battle of Flodden. English forces faced the Scottish army. The Scots have pikes, long spears that have dominated European warfare for decades. The English have bills, a type of polearm, and they have something else, something new, something terrifying. Not the guns you're imagining. These aren't rifles or pistols, they're arquebuses, crude, heavy, wildly inaccurate firearms that required a forked stick to prop them up and a lit match to fire them. They were slow to load, difficult to aim, and they had a nasty habit of exploding, but they were terrifying. When an arquebus fired, it made a sound like thunder, it produced smoke and flame, and if the ball actually hit you, which was statistically unlikely, it would smash through armour, shatter bones, and leave wounds that almost never healed. The Scots lost at Flodden, not because English guns were superior, but because the English had learned to combine different weapons, bills to counter pikes, archers to harass from a distance, and guns to create chaos and fear. Tudor firearms were terrible technology. Let's be clear about that. They were dangerous to everyone involved. Loading one required pouring loose gunpowder down the barrel, praying it was the right amount, because too little and the ball wouldn't fire, too much and the barrel would explode. Then you'd ram a lead ball down the barrel with a rod. Then you'd pour a tiny bit of powder into the flash pan. Then you'd light a slow match, a length of cord soaked in saltpeter that smouldered slowly. Then you'd blow on the match to make it glow. Then you'd touch it to the flash pan. Then you'd pray. If everything went right, the powder in the flash pan would ignite, send a jet of flame through a small hole into the main barrel, ignite the main powder charge, and fire the ball. If anything went wrong, the gun could misfire, the barrel could burst, the powder could ignite too early and blow off your hand. The slow match could set your clothes on fire. Or, most commonly, the rain would put out your match and you'd be standing there with an expensive metal club while the enemy charged you with sharp objects. And yet, the Tudors loved guns. They kept improving them, making them smaller, more reliable, more deadly. By the mid-1500s, English gunsmiths had developed the musket, heavier than an arquebus, longer range, more stopping power, still terrible, still slow, still dangerous, but terrifying enough that armies started replacing archers with musketeers. This was a big deal. English longbowmen had dominated European battlefields for centuries. They could fire 10 to 12 arrows a minute with accuracy up to 200 yards. A musketeer could fire maybe 2 shots a minute if he was skilled and lucky, and hitting a target at 50 yards was an achievement. But here's why guns won. Training. It took years to train a longbowman. You had to start as a child, building the strength and technique to draw a 100-pound bow. Archery wasn't a hobby, it was a lifestyle. The skeletons of medieval archers showed deformed bones from the constant stress. But a musketeer, you could train a musketeer in a few weeks. Point this end at the enemy, pull this trigger, don't drop the powder. Congratulations, you're now a soldier. Guns democratized warfare. They made peasants as dangerous as knights. A farmer with a musket could kill a nobleman in full armour. That was new. That was revolutionary. And the nobility hated it. But they adapted, because they had to. By the end of the Tudor period, English armies were using complex formations. Pike squares to hold off cavalry, musketeers to fire volleys into enemy formations, cavalry to exploit gaps. It was combined arms warfare, and it required technology. Not just guns, gunpowder. The manufacture of gunpowder was a closely guarded secret. You needed saltpeter, potassium nitrate, which was collected by scraping the walls of cellars and latrines where it formed naturally from decomposing organic matter. Yes, they were collecting crystallized piss to make explosives. Then you needed charcoal and sulfur, and you had to mix them in exactly the right proportions. Too much saltpeter and the powder would burn too fast, too little, and it wouldn't ignite. The mixing process was dangerous. Sparks could set off the whole batch. Powder mills exploded regularly, killing everyone inside. But the Tudors needed gunpowder. For guns, for cannons, for mining, breaking rocks in quarries and mines by drilling holes, filling them with powder and blowing them apart. By Elizabeth I's reign, England was manufacturing gunpowder on an industrial scale. The Tower of London had powder mills. So did royal dockyards. The country was creating the infrastructure for perpetual warfare, and it was all based on guns that barely worked. But here's the thing about Tudor guns. They didn't have to work well. They just had to work better than nothing. A musket might misfire half the time, but the other half of the time, it could kill someone from a distance, and that was enough. The psychological effect was enormous. Imagine being a soldier armed with a pike. You've trained for months, you're in formation, you're marching toward the enemy, and then you hear it. A thunderous crack, smoke. Your friend beside you collapses with a hole in his chest. You can't see who fired, can't see where the shot came from. Just smoke, and noise and death. Guns made warfare impersonal. Terrifying. You could be killed by someone you never saw. Someone who didn't need to be strong or skilled or brave. Just someone who could point a metal tube in your direction and pull a trigger. The Tudors understood this. They invested heavily in gun technology. Not because guns were reliable, but because they were terrifying. And in warfare, terror is a weapon as valuable as steel. But guns weren't the only thing killing people. Because while soldiers were shooting each other on battlefields, back in the palaces and manor houses, civilians were dying too, slowly, painfully, from something they applied to their own faces every single morning, something they knew was poisonous, something they wore anyway. Queen Elizabeth I dies at Richmond Palace. She's 69 years old. Her face is caked in white makeup, so thick you could carve your initials in it. Her hair is a wig, her teeth are black stumps, and her skin, underneath all that paint, is scarred and ruined, eaten away by the very thing that was supposed to make her beautiful. This is what vanity cost in the Tudor period. Your face, your health, sometimes your life. Let's talk about Elizabethan beauty standards, because they were insane. Pale skin was essential. It signified nobility. If you had a tan, you were a peasant who worked outdoors. If your skin was pale, almost translucent, you were wealthy, refined, untouched by labour. So women and men, because Tudor men wore makeup too, would cover their faces in white paint. Ceruse, they called it, a thick paste made from white lead and vinegar. You'd spread it on your face, your neck, your chest. It would dry to a smooth porcelain finish. You'd look like a statue, elegant, ethereal, slowly dying, because ceruse was poison, lead poisoning, and people knew it. They knew it caused symptoms, hair loss, skin lesions, tremors, paralysis, death. They just didn't care, because beauty was worth it. Elizabeth I was addicted to ceruse. She'd been wearing it since she was a young woman, and by the end of her life, her face was destroyed. The lead had eaten through her skin, leaving scars and pockmarks, so she wore more makeup, thicker layers, covering the damage with more poison. It became a vicious cycle, The makeup ruined your skin. The ruined skin made you wear more makeup. The more makeup you wore, the worse your skin became. Until eventually, your face was just a mask. A white, cracking mask covering scarred, poisoned flesh. But women didn't just use ceruse. They used other cosmetics too. Rouge made from cinnabar, mercury sulfide, to add colour to the cheeks and lips. Mercury, another poison, it caused tremors, psychological problems, and death. They used belladonna, deadly nightshade, to dilate their pupils. Because large pupils were considered attractive, they made you look young, innocent, aroused, and all you had to do was drip poison directly into your eyes and risk going blind. They used arsenic to whiten their skin, because apparently lead wasn't poisonous enough. Arsenic gave the skin a translucent, glowing quality. It also caused stomach problems, heart failure, and death. But you'd look fantastic in your coffin. Men weren't exempt. Tudor noblemen wore makeup too. Not as much as women, but enough to show they were refined. They used ceruse. They dyed their hair. They wore perfumes, heavy, musky scents that masked the smell of unwashed bodies and rotting teeth. And everyone bathed in dangerous substances. Mercury baths were popular for treating syphilis. The theory was that mercury would drive the disease out through your pores. The reality was that mercury would poison you, often killing you faster than the syphilis would have. People washed their faces with solutions containing lead, sulfur, and quicksilver, liquid mercury. They applied masks made from crushed pearls, egg whites, and borax. They rubbed their skin with pumice stones to exfoliate, often rubbing so hard they'd bleed. Beauty was pain, literally, and the Tudors embraced it because appearance was everything. In a society where your position, your prospects, your entire life depended on how you looked and who you impressed, you couldn't afford not to wear makeup, even if it was killing you. Queen Elizabeth I knew the makeup was poisonous. Her ladies-in-waiting knew. Her physicians knew. Everyone knew. But stopping wasn't an option, because without the makeup, people would see her real face. The scars, the aging, the mortality, and a queen couldn't afford to look mortal, couldn't afford to look weak. So she wore the mask, every day, layers of white lead, layers of rouge, layers of lies, until the mask became her face. Tudor technology gave people tools to transform themselves, to become more beautiful, more impressive, more desirable, and in the process, it destroyed them from the inside out, slowly, methodically, poisoning them one application at a time while they stared in mirrors and admired how perfect they looked. But cosmetics weren't the only dangerous beauty technology, because while women were painting their faces with poison, they were also engineering their bodies into shapes that nature never intended, into shapes that required metal, whalebone, and the willingness to sacrifice the ability to breathe properly for the privilege of looking like a geometric figure. Imagine breathing. Now imagine breathing with a cage around your ribcage, metal, whalebone, laced so tight that your waist shrinks by 4 inches. Your internal organs shift, compress, relocate, find new places to exist inside a body that's been forced into an unnatural shape. Welcome to the Tudor wardrobe, where fashion was a full-contact sport and your body was just a suggestion that needed correction. Let's start with the farthingale, a bell-shaped cage made of hoops, wood or whalebone, that women wore under their skirts. It made your hips look enormous, impossibly wide, which was the point. Because the wider your hips, the smaller your waist looked by comparison. You couldn't sit down in a farthingale, not properly. You'd perch on the edge of chairs, the cage tilting up behind you. You couldn't walk through narrow doors, couldn't move quickly, couldn't do anything that required actual mobility, but you looked spectacular, like a geometric shape, a cone, a bell, a statement that said, "I'm so wealthy I can wear a piece of furniture as clothing." And on top of the farthingale, you'd wear multiple layers, a kirtle, a petticoat, a gown, sometimes 2 gowns, all of them heavy, embroidered, jewelled, weighing 30, 40, sometimes 50 pounds. Just getting dressed was an ordeal. It took multiple servants, an hour or more. You couldn't dress yourself. The laces were in the back. The layers were too complex. You needed help. Which was the point. Because needing servants was a status symbol. But it gets worse. Because underneath all those layers, you're wearing stays, the Tudor version of a corset, made from layers of linen stiffened with paste and reinforced with whalebone. They'd lace it tight. Force your body into a smooth, conical shape. No curves, no softness. Just a rigid, geometric ideal. Your breasts would be flattened, pushed up and out, creating that distinctive Tudor silhouette. Your waist would be compressed, your ribs would strain against the whalebone, and you'd breathe in short, shallow gasps because deep breaths weren't an option anymore. Women fainted constantly. This wasn't surprising. You're wearing 50 pounds of clothing, your organs are compressed, you can't breathe properly, and you're probably tightly laced into stays that are restricting blood flow. But fainting was seen as feminine, delicate, proof that you were a refined lady and not some coarse peasant who could handle physical exertion. So women cultivated the ability to faint gracefully, to swoon, to need male assistance just to remain conscious. It was all performance, all theatre. Your body wasn't your body. It was a canvas, a statement, a political tool. And men had their own ridiculous clothing requirements. Doublets, tight-fitting jackets that were padded and structured to create an artificial chest. A peas-cod belly, a stuffed protruding front that made you look like you had a beer gut. Because apparently, in Tudor fashion logic, looking like an overfed goose was attractive. They wore trunk hose, shorts that were stuffed with wool, horsehair or rags to make them puff out, creating enormous, bulbous thighs. You'd look like you had balloons attached to your hips, and codpieces. Let's talk about codpieces, because the Tudors took a practical garment, a flap that covered the gap between your hose, and turned it into a statement piece. They made them prominent, padded, sometimes enormous, decorated with jewels and embroidery. Henry VIII's armour had a codpiece, a metal codpiece on his suit of armour. Because apparently, even when preparing for battle, you needed to advertise your masculinity. But here's what's important about Tudor clothing. It wasn't just fashion, it was technology. The ability to create structured garments, to dye fabric in specific colours, to weave complex patterns, all of that required expertise, infrastructure, trade networks. The production of a single aristocratic gown required wool from England, silk from Italy, gold thread from Spain, dyes from the Americas, and the labour of dozens of craftspeople, weavers, dyers, embroiderers, tailors. It was a global supply chain, and clothing was a visual language. The colours you wore indicated your status. Purple was for royalty, scarlet for nobility. Sumptuary laws restricted what colours and fabrics different social classes could wear. If you were a merchant and you wore velvet, you could be fined. If you were a servant and you wore silk, you could be jailed. Your clothing broadcast your position in society. And getting it wrong was a crime. Fashion wasn't just vanity, it wasn't just aesthetics. It was a technology of control, a visible, walking advertisement of exactly where you stood in the social hierarchy. A way to make sure everyone knew their place, to restrict movement, both physical and social, to turn your body into a statement that you couldn't escape, even if you wanted to. And it was miserable. Women couldn't breathe. Men couldn't move their arms properly. Everyone was hot, uncomfortable, and constantly aware that their clothing could bankrupt them. But they kept doing it, because the alternative was social death. If you couldn't afford proper clothing, you couldn't attend court, couldn't make connections, couldn't advance. You'd be dismissed, ignored, erased. So people mortgaged their estates to buy gowns, went into debt for doublets, suffered for fashion, and the clothing industry thrived, becoming one of the most important sectors of the Tudor economy. Fashion wasn't the only place where the Tudors built elaborate stages for performance. Because while people were transforming their bodies with corsets and codpieces, they were also transforming their homes into something unprecedented. Not castles, not fortifications, but theatres. Buildings designed not to keep enemies out, but to let the right people in and make absolutely certain they knew exactly where they stood in the social order. Henry VIII decides to build a palace. Not just any palace, Nonsuch Palace, called that because there was supposed to be nothing else in England that could match it. Nothing. Nonsuch. The palace had towers, battlements, decorative turrets that served no defensive purpose. The walls were covered in stucco panels showing scenes from classical mythology. Gods, heroes, naked women. It was basically a giant propaganda piece. A three-dimensional advertisement for Henry's magnificence. And inside, even more spectacular. Gilt ceilings, carved wood panelling, tapestries, stained glass, every surface decorated. Every room designed to overwhelm visitors with the wealth and power of the king. But here's the thing about Nonsuch Palace. It was never finished. Henry died. The project dragged on. And eventually, in the 1680s, it was demolished. Torn down for building materials. Nothing remains except foundation stones and historical descriptions. But during its brief existence, Nonsuch represented a new kind of architecture. Not castles, not fortifications, but showpieces. Buildings designed not for defence but for display. This was happening across England. The Tudor nobility were abandoning their drafty medieval castles and building new houses, prodigy houses they're called, enormous country estates with more windows than walls, with long galleries for promenading, with elaborate gardens, with architecture that prioritised aesthetics over security. Because the Tudor period was, relatively speaking, peaceful. There were no civil wars after 1485, no major invasions. The nobility didn't need castles anymore. They needed stages, places to perform the theatre of aristocratic life. Take Hardwicke Hall. Built in the 1590s by Bess of Hardwicke, one of the wealthiest women in England. The building is famous for its windows, enormous windows. So many windows that people said, Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall. Glass was expensive, phenomenally expensive. Window glass had to be imported or made by specialist craftsmen. Each pane was small, maybe 6 inches across, and had to be held in place with lead camming. Building a window required dozens or hundreds of panes. It was a statement of wealth, but it was also a statement of modernity, because glass windows meant light, lots of light. Tudor houses were bright, airy, a complete contrast to medieval castles with their narrow slits and dark interiors. The downside, glass windows were cold, drafty. Single-pane glass with lead frames doesn't provide much insulation, so Tudor houses were freezing in winter. People would hang thick tapestries on the walls for insulation, would huddle around fireplaces, would basically live in 1 or 2 rooms during the cold months while the rest of the house froze. But it looked impressive, and that mattered more than comfort. Tudor houses also featured something new: chimneys, lots of chimneys. Before the Tudor period, most houses had a central hearth with smoke venting through a hole in the roof. It was smoky, inefficient, horrible, but Tudor builders developed the chimney, a vertical shaft that channeled smoke out of the house. It was revolutionary. Suddenly, you could have multiple fireplaces, multiple heated rooms. You could cook without filling the entire house with smoke. The design of chimneys became an art form. Tudor houses had decorative chimney stacks, twisted, ornamented, visible from miles away, because even your smoke exhaust was an opportunity to show off. Inside, Tudor houses featured long galleries. These were rooms designed for walking, for exercise in bad weather, for displaying art, for showing off. They'd stretch the entire length of the house, sometimes 100 feet or more. You'd walk the gallery in the afternoon, back and forth, getting your steps in, looking at portraits, gossiping. It was the Tudor equivalent of a gym and a social club. And everywhere, decoration. Plasterwork on the ceilings, wood panelling on the walls, elaborate fireplaces carved with coats of arms, stained glass windows showing family crests. Every surface was an opportunity to broadcast your identity, your lineage, your wealth. But here's what's really interesting about Tudor architecture. It was technology. The builders understood engineering. They could calculate loads, design roof trusses that could span huge rooms without internal support, create elaborate timber frames that were both strong and decorative. Tudor carpenters were masters of joinery. They could create complex joints, mortise and tenon, dovetails, scarf joints that held timbers together without nails. The timber frame of a Tudor house could last centuries, and many of them have. You can still visit Tudor houses across England, still see the original timber frames, still walk through rooms that were built 500 years ago. But the technology wasn't just structural, it was theatrical. Tudor houses were designed for entertaining, for impressing guests, for staging the elaborate rituals of aristocratic life. When you visited a great house, you'd be received in the Great Hall, a massive room with a hammer beam roof and a raised dais at one end. The Lord would sit on the dais. You'd stand in the body of the hall. The architecture reinforced hierarchy, made power visible. Then you'd be led through a series of rooms, each more private than the last. The screen's passage, the parlour, the great chamber, and finally, if you were important enough, the presence chamber, the Lord's private room, the inner sanctum. This was called the enfilade, a sequence of rooms that grew progressively more exclusive, and your status determined how far you could penetrate. Most visitors never made it past the Great Hall. Only the most important guests reached the presence chamber. It was architecture as social control, as a technology for managing access and reinforcing hierarchy, and it was incredibly effective. But Tudor houses had a dark side. They were fire traps, all that timber, all that decoration, and fireplaces in every room. Fires were common, devastating. Entire houses would burn to the ground in hours, and they were unhealthy. The windows might let in light, but they also let in cold. The fireplaces produced smoke and carbon monoxide. The lead in the window, caming, and the paint was toxic. The buildings were beautiful. They were also trying to kill you. This is a pattern with Tudor technology. It's brilliant, it's innovative, it's impressive, and it's also dangerous, because the Tudors were always pushing boundaries, always trying to do more, build bigger, go further, without fully understanding the risks. Which brings us back to where we started. To Sir John Harrington's flushing toilet, the invention that seemed so simple, so benign, so obviously useful, and yet somehow managed to be more dangerous than it had any right to be. Remember that toilet? The one that was so loud Elizabeth barely used it? There's more to that story, and it gets worse. The basic design was brilliant. A cistern filled with water, a valve that opened to release the water, a bowl to sit on, a pipe that led to a cesspit outside. Pull a lever, water rushes down, everything gets flushed away. Simple, elegant, revolutionary. It worked, technically. The problem was the execution. The water cistern was 7.5 gallons. When you released it, 7.5 gallons of water came rushing down, with force, creating a roar that echoed through the palace. Elizabeth I's courtiers reported that when the toilet flushed, it sounded like a waterfall. You could hear it from rooms away. And in a time when privacy was already minimal, when walls were thin and everyone was constantly listening for gossip, a toilet that announced your business to the entire palace was not ideal. So Elizabeth barely used it. She had it installed at Richmond Palace. She demonstrated it to guests, but for her actual needs, she continued using a close stool, a padded box with a pewter or ceramic pot inside. Portable, silent, dignified. But the flush toilet represented something important, the idea that human waste could be mechanically removed, that you didn't have to carry chamber pots, didn't have to smell the contents, could just pull a lever and make it disappear. The catch was where it disappeared to, the cesspit, a large pit dug in the ground and lined with brick or stone. The waste would drain into the pit, and eventually, when the pit was full, someone would have to empty it. That someone was a gong firmer, a night soil collector. They'd dig out the cesspit in the middle of the night, hence night soil, load the waste into carts and haul it away. It was possibly the worst job in Tudor England. The smell was indescribable, the risk of disease was enormous, and you were literally swimming in shit. Gong firmers were paid well. They had to be. No one would do the job otherwise, but even with good pay, the mortality rate was high. They'd fall into cesspits and drown. They'd inhale toxic gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and suffocate. They'd contract diseases and die within weeks. But cities needed them, because without gong firmers, the cesspits would overflow. The streets would flood with sewage. Disease would spread. So gong firmers were essential, necessary, and completely expendable. This is what Tudor sanitation technology actually was. Not hygiene, not health, but a system for moving waste from one place to another. From your house to a pit. From the pit to a cart. From the cart to a field where it would be used as fertilizer. It was circular, in theory. In practice, it was chaos. Cesspits leaked, contaminated wells, spread disease, killed people. But the Tudors didn't understand germ theory. Didn't know that bacteria in sewage could cause cholera, typhoid, dysentery. They just knew that shit smelled bad and should be kept away from living spaces. So they built elaborate drainage systems. In London, open ditches carried sewage to the Thames. In smaller towns, people just threw it in the streets and hoped rain would wash it away. In castles, garderobes, toilet shafts built into the walls dropped waste directly into the moat or onto the ground below. And in one spectacular case, people died because of a toilet. In 1184, at Erfurt Castle in Germany, not Tudor England, but the story's too good not to tell, a group of nobles gathered in a second-floor room. Too many nobles, too much weight. The floor, which was built over the cesspit, collapsed. 60 noblemen fell into the cesspit below and drowned in shit. Tudor castles didn't have that exact problem, but guardrobes were still dangerous. They were cold, drafty, open to the outside, and if you leaned too far out, trying to see something, trying to call to someone below, you could fall. It happened. People fell out of guardrobes and died, but the real danger of Tudor toilets wasn't falling or drowning. It was disease. Because human waste breeds disease. And when your water supply is contaminated by your waste disposal system, people die. This is what happened during Tudor plague outbreaks. The Great Plague of 1563, the Plague of 1592, 1593. People living in crowded urban areas with inadequate sanitation, waste in the streets, contaminated wells, rats thriving in the filth, fleas carrying plague bacteria jumping from rats to humans. Toilet technology, or the lack of it, killed more people in Tudor England than all the wars combined. Because when you don't have proper sanitation, disease thrives, spreads, becomes endemic. The Tudors tried to fight this with regulations. In London, there were laws about waste disposal, where you could build cesspits, how often they had to be emptied. But enforcement was spotty. People ignored the laws, and plague kept returning. It wasn't until the Victorian period, 300 years later, that England finally built a proper sewer system. The technology existed in Tudor times. The Romans had built sophisticated sewers 1,500 years earlier, but the Tudors never implemented it, never invested in infrastructure. Because spending money on sewers wasn't glamorous, wasn't impressive, didn't demonstrate royal power. So instead, they built palaces, wore expensive clothes, fought wars, and died of diseases that could have been prevented with better plumbing. This is the dark side of Tudor technology. The missed opportunities, the places where they could have improved lives but chose spectacle instead, where they had the knowledge but not the will. And yet, while the Tudors were failing at sanitation, while people were drowning in cesspits and dying of plague because no one wanted to invest in proper sewers, they were succeeding brilliantly at something else. Something that didn't look impressive, something that didn't demonstrate royal power, something that was just wheels. Turning in rivers, doing work. England is at war with Spain. The Spanish Armada is sailing toward England's coast with 130 ships and 30,000 men. English ships are preparing to meet it with cannons. Lots of cannons, more cannons than the Spanish anticipated, more cannons than made sense for such a small country. Where did they all come from? Let me explain. Making a cannon requires iron. Lots of iron. You need to smelt iron ore, turning it from rock into molten metal. And that requires heat. Intense, sustained heat. The kind of heat that comes from charcoal fires, fed by massive bellows. And what powered those bellows? Water wheels. Large wooden wheels turned by rivers and streams. The wheels drove hammers that pounded iron, drove bellows that fed furnaces, drove saws that cut wood, drove mills that ground grain. Watermills were the engines of Tudor industry, and they were everywhere. By the end of the 16th century, England had thousands of watermills. Every river had mills. Every stream that could generate enough flow had mills. They weren't new technology. Watermills had existed for over 1,000 years, but the Tudors perfected them, made them more efficient, more powerful, more specialised. There were corn mills for grinding grain, fulling mills for cleaning wool, sawmills for cutting timber, hammer mills for forging iron, paper mills for making paper. The water wheel was the universal power source, and it transformed the economy, because suddenly tasks that required human or animal power could be mechanised. A single watermill could do the work of dozens of men, could operate continuously as long as the river flowed, could produce goods on a scale that was previously impossible. The Weald of Kent and Sussex became the centre of English iron production. Why? Because it had forests for charcoal, iron ore deposits, and rivers to power the mills. By the 1550s, the Weald was producing tons of iron annually. Iron for tools, for horseshoes, for cannon. This is how England became a military power. Not through superior tactics, not through better soldiers, but through industrial capacity, the ability to produce weapons on a massive scale, to outfit armies and navies with equipment that other nations couldn't match, and it was all powered by water. By carefully engineered mills that converted the kinetic energy of flowing water into mechanical power. The technology was simple: a wheel with paddles, a shaft, gears to transmit the motion. But the applications were revolutionary. There's a watermill at Sarhole Mill in Birmingham that's been operating since the 18th century, built on the site of earlier mills going back to Tudor times. The building is different, but the principle is the same. Water flows, wheel turns, gears engage, millstone grinds. It's elegant, efficient, and it worked for hundreds of years. But watermills had a drawback. They were location dependent. You needed flowing water. You needed consistent flow. Not too much in spring floods, not too little in summer droughts. And you needed to be near the river. This created geographic limitations. Industries clustered around rivers. Towns grew up around mills, and the ownership of mills became a source of power. If you controlled the mill, you controlled production, controlled the local economy. Mill rights were valuable. Feudal lords held the rights to mills and charged tolls for their use. If you wanted your grain ground, you paid the miller. If you wanted your wool fulled, you paid the miller. It was a monopoly, and it made millers wealthy, but it also made them hated, because everyone had to use the mill, had no choice, and millers had a reputation for cheating, for taking more than their share of grain as payment, for using false weights, for being generally corrupt. There's a reason the Canterbury Tales includes a crooked miller. It was a stereotype based on reality. Millers had power, and they abused it, but the technology itself was neutral. The water wheel didn't care who owned it or what it was used for. It just converted energy, did work, enabled production, and that production enabled everything else. The food supply, the textile industry, the iron industry, the paper industry. Without water mills, Tudor England couldn't have functioned, couldn't have fed its population, couldn't have armed its soldiers, couldn't have competed with European powers. Water mills were foundational technology, invisible, taken for granted, but absolutely essential. And they're a reminder that the most important technologies aren't always the most dramatic. Sometimes they're just wheels turning in rivers, doing work, enabling civilization. But water mills couldn't move. They sat in one place, grinding grain, forging iron, sawing timber. If you wanted to move goods, move people, move armies across water, you needed something else, something that could harness a different kind of power. Wind, tide, human muscle, something that could float, and yet somehow not sink immediately. And the Tudors built those too. Built ships that were technological marvels, engineering masterpieces, floating fortresses that could cross oceans and wage war and carry hundreds of men. Ships that were also, without question, death traps. Henry VIII stands on the shore, watching his flagship sink. It's a calm day, no storm, no battle. The Mary Rose just tips over and sinks, taking 500 men with it. The king watches his pride, his magnificent warship, his floating castle, disappear beneath the waves in minutes. What happened? Overloading. The Mary Rose was a carrack, a type of ship with multiple decks and heavy armament. It had 91 guns, cannons on multiple decks, and when the ship turned sharply, the lower gun ports, which were open for ventilation, dipped below the waterline. Water rushed in. The ship listed, more water poured in, and within minutes, the Mary Rose was gone. This is Tudor shipbuilding. Ambitious, innovative, and deeply flawed. Let's talk about how Tudor ships were built. The process started with selecting timber. Oak for the frame, pine for the masts, elm for the parts that would be underwater, because elm resists rot when submerged. The shipwrights would lay the keel first, the spine of the ship. Then they'd build the ribs, curved timbers that form the skeleton. Then they'd plank the hull, attaching wooden boards to the ribs, with wooden pegs called tree nails. No screws, no bolts, just wood pegged together, and corked with oakum, tarred rope fibres stuffed into the gaps between planks to make the hull watertight. In theory. In practice, Tudor ships leaked constantly. The oakum would work loose, planks would separate, water would seep in. Every ship had pumps, multiple pumps, and sailors whose entire job was pumping water out of the bilge. If they stopped pumping, the ship would sink. But despite this, Tudor ships were impressive. The Mary Rose was 148 feet long, could carry 700 men, had multiple decks, was armed like a floating fortress, and before it sank, it was one of the most advanced warships in Europe. Tudor shipbuilders were pushing boundaries, making ships bigger, faster, more heavily armed. They developed the race-built galleon, a sleeker, faster design with a lower profile and better sailing characteristics. Ships like the Golden Hind, which Francis Drake sailed around the world. These ships were technological marvels. They could sail into the wind using triangular, lateen sails, could navigate using the instruments we talked about earlier, could cross oceans, and they did. Tudor ships reached the Americas, Africa, Asia. They circumnavigated the globe. They explored, traded, conquered, but they were death traps. Storms could sink them. Leaks could sink them. Poor design could sink them. And even if the ship didn't sink, life aboard was miserable. Sailors slept in shifts in cramped quarters below deck. They ate hardtack, a brick-hard biscuit, and salted meat. They drank beer because water would go bad. They worked in all weather, and they died constantly. From scurvy, from infections, from accidents. Falling from the rigging was common. You're 50 feet in the air, clinging to rope, trying to adjust a sail in heavy wind. One slip and you're dead, either from the fall or from hitting the water and not being recovered before you drowned. And if you fell overboard in a storm, the ship wasn't stopping, couldn't stop. You'd watch the ship sail away, and then you'd drown, alone, in the middle of the ocean. But sailors kept signing up, because the alternative was worse: poverty, starvation, life on land as a labourer with no prospects. At least on a ship you had a chance. You might discover new lands, might capture a Spanish treasure ship, might come home wealthy, or you might die. But that was always the risk. Tudor ship technology was all about risk management. How much could you push the design? How heavy could you make the ship? How many guns could you add? How far could you sail? And the answer was always a little bit further than was safe, but not so far that you definitely died. The Mary Rose was the exception. It crossed that line, carried too many guns, had design flaws that made it unstable, and it paid the price. But even after the Mary Rose sank, Tudor shipbuilders kept pushing, kept building bigger ships, heavier ships, more ambitious ships, because that's what exploration required. Risk, innovation, the willingness to build something that might not work, and to sail it anyway. This is what technology is at its core: risk, the willingness to try something new, to push boundaries, to fail, and then to try again. The Tudors failed constantly. Their ships sank. Their inventions didn't work. Their ambitious projects collapsed. But they kept trying, kept building, kept innovating, and slowly, incrementally, they made progress. But while kings were commissioning massive warships, and nobles were building prodigy houses, and explorers were sailing around the world, there was other technology, quieter technology, less impressive, the kind of technology that didn't get commissioned by royalty, or celebrated in court, or memorialized in paintings. The technology that actually built the world. A carpenter in London is building a house. He has tools, a saw, a hammer, a chisel, an adze, planes, measuring devices, and every single one of them is handmade, hand-forged, customized to his hand and his work, and shaped by years of use. These aren't mass-produced tools. Each one is unique, made by a blacksmith who understood metallurgy, who knew how to heat iron to exactly the right temperature, how to hammer it into shape, how to harden the edge by quenching it in water or oil, how to temper it so it wouldn't be too brittle. Tool making was an art form, a science, and the quality of your tools determined the quality of your work. A good saw could last a lifetime. The blade was thin, flexible. The teeth were filed by hand, each one carefully shaped to cut on the push stroke, or the pull stroke depending on the design. A skilled carpenter could saw a perfectly straight line through a timber without marking it first. Just feel, experience, and a really good saw. The same with chisels. A sharp chisel could pare wood so thin you could see through the shaving, could cut joints that fit together perfectly without glue, could carve details so fine they looked like lace. Tudor craftsmen were obsessed with sharpness. They'd spend hours sharpening tools, using whetstones, oil stones, leather strops, getting an edge so sharp it could split a hair. Because a sharp tool was efficient, made work easier, made better products. And these tools weren't just for professionals. Every household had tools. A knife, an axe, a needle and thread, a spindle for spinning wool, a distaff for holding the fibre, a loom for weaving. These were survival tools. If you couldn't sew, your clothes would fall apart. If you couldn't spin thread, you'd have no cloth. If you couldn't sharpen your knife, you couldn't cut food, couldn't work, couldn't defend yourself. So everyone learned basic tool use. Children learned young. By age 7, a child could use a knife safely, could help with spinning, could assist with basic tasks, because in the Tudor period, childhood was short. You became useful as quickly as possible, or you were a burden. But some tools were specialised, professional tools for specific trades. A cobbler's last, a foot-shaped form for making shoes, a fletcher's jig for making arrows, a cooper's adze for shaping barrel staves. These tools were passed down through generations, from master to apprentice. each one carrying years of knowledge and skill. And the tools themselves evolved, slowly, incrementally. A blacksmith would make a hammer, use it, notice a flaw, make the next one slightly different. Over years, over generations, the design would improve, become more efficient, more specialized, more perfect. This is how technology actually progresses, not through sudden breakthroughs, but through tiny improvements, each craftsman making their tools slightly better, each generation building on the last, until you have tools that are so well designed, so perfectly fitted to their purpose, that they remain essentially unchanged for centuries. A Tudor hand plane looks almost identical to a modern hand plane, because the design was perfected 500 years ago. Same with saws, hammers, chisels. The basic forms haven't changed, can't be improved upon. They're perfect for their purpose. But here's what's important about Tudor tools. They democratize skill. A good tool let an average craftsman do excellent work. A bad tool made even a master craftsman struggle. So access to tools was access to economic opportunity. Tool theft was a serious crime. Stealing a carpenter's tools could end his livelihood. He couldn't work without them, couldn't support his family. So tools were guarded carefully, kept close, never loaned without trust, and tools were expensive. A set of carpenter's tools might cost as much as a year's wages. An apprentice would spend years saving to buy his own tools. And when he finally did, when he became a journeyman with his own tool chest, that was a rite of passage. Proof that he was now a professional. Tudor technology wasn't just spectacular inventions, wasn't just clocks and ships and printing presses. It was everyday tools, the hammers and saws and needles that let people work, build, create, survive. Because while kings were building palaces and explorers were sailing around the world, ordinary people were using those simple tools to build the actual world they lived in. The houses, the furniture, the clothes, the infrastructure of daily life. And those tools, those simple pieces of shaped metal and wood, were just as important as any invention. Maybe more important, because without them nothing else could happen. No palaces, no ships, no books, just people with no way to shape the world around them. Tudor tool technology was foundational, invisible, but absolutely essential. And it's a reminder that the most important technologies aren't always the flashiest. Sometimes they're just a really good chisel, a sharp saw, a hammer that feels right in your hand. But while carpenters were building houses with tools that were perfected over generations, there were other professionals using tools that looked remarkably similar. Tools with sharp edges, tools designed to cut, tools that required precision and steady hands. The difference was what they were cutting, not wood, flesh. And these tools, unlike carpenter's tools, hadn't been perfected over generations. They were still experimental, still being figured out, still killing more people than they saved. A surgeon is preparing to amputate a soldier's leg. The leg is infected, gangrenous, black and stinking. If it stays on, the infection will spread through the body and the soldier will die screaming within days. So it has to come off. The surgeon has tools, a saw, a knife, cautery irons, metal rods heated in a fire until they glow red. And nothing for pain, no anesthesia, no morphine, no whiskey, just 4 strong men to hold the patient down, and speed. The fastest surgeons could amputate a leg in under 2 minutes, 2 minutes of unimaginable pain. The patient would be held down by several strong men. The surgeon would slice through the flesh in a circular cut, would saw through the bone, would cauterize the stump with red-hot iron to stop the bleeding, and then it would be over. If the patient didn't die from shock or blood loss, they might survive. Might. This was Tudor surgery, brutal, desperate, and your best chance at survival from certain death. Tudor medical technology was limited by one fundamental problem. They didn't understand infection, didn't understand that bacteria cause disease, didn't understand that washing your hands or sterilizing your tools prevented infection. So surgeons would use the same knife on multiple patients without cleaning it, would reach into open wounds with dirty hands, would use the same bandages on different people, and then they'd wonder why so many patients died after surgery. The answer, obviously, was infection. But Tudor physicians didn't know that. They thought diseases were caused by imbalanced humours, by bad air, miasmas, by divine punishment, so their treatments focused on balancing the body, bloodletting, purging, inducing vomiting, making the patient worse in an attempt to make them better. But they did have some effective treatments, mostly by accident. Willow bark for pain relief. It contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Did the Tudors know why it worked? No, but they knew it did, so they used it. Honey for wound dressing. Honey is antibacterial. It prevents infection. Again, the Tudors didn't know why, but they'd been using honey on wounds for thousands of years because it helped healing. Maggots for cleaning infected wounds. This sounds horrifying, but maggots eat dead tissue. Only dead tissue. They'll clean a wound better than any surgeon, leaving healthy tissue intact. Tudor physicians used maggots. Not often, but they knew it worked. So Tudor medicine wasn't entirely useless. Some treatments were effective, but they were mixed in with treatments that were actively harmful, and there was no way to tell which was which. Trepanning, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure or let out evil spirits. Sometimes this actually helped if the patient had a skull fracture and brain swelling. More often, it just killed them. Mercury for syphilis. As we discussed earlier, mercury was poison, but syphilis was also killing you. So the treatment was to poison yourself, slightly less than the disease was poisoning you, and hope you died slower from the cure than from the disease. Some people survived, most didn't. Tobacco smoke enemas for drowning victims? Yes, really. They'd blow tobacco smoke up the victim's rectum. The theory was it would stimulate breathing. Did it work? No, but it was popular for over a century. Tudor physicians had other strange tools. Fleams for bloodletting, spring-loaded blades that would make a quick cut to open a vein, cupping glasses that created suction to draw out blood or bad humours, forceps for delivering babies, speculums for examining patients, catheters for draining bladders. These tools look like torture devices, and in many cases they felt like torture devices, because surgery without anaesthesia was torture. Examination without sterile technique was torture. Medical intervention in the Tudor period often did more harm than good. But there were exceptions. Tudor physicians were excellent bone setters. They understood how to set broken bones, how to splint them, how to immobilize them so they'd heal properly. They developed traction devices, basically medieval stretching racks that could realign broken bones. It was painful, but it worked. They understood herbal medicine, knew which plants treated which ailments. Digitalis for heart problems, opium for pain, ergot for stopping bleeding. They didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the results, and they were starting to understand anatomy. Thanks to people like Andreas Vesalius, who published the first accurate anatomical text in 1543, Tudor physicians began dissecting bodies, studying how organs connected, how blood flowed, how the body actually worked. This knowledge didn't immediately improve treatment, but it laid the groundwork. It started the shift from humoral theory to scientific medicine, from mysticism to empiricism. The problem was application. Even with better knowledge, Tudor physicians couldn't do much. They couldn't perform internal surgery, couldn't treat infections, couldn't cure most diseases. They could set bones, deliver babies sometimes, treat symptoms, and mostly just watch patients die. The best medical technology the Tudors had was prevention. Quarantine for plague, burning infected houses, isolating the sick. These measures worked, not because they understood disease transmission, but because they'd learned through experience that isolation slowed spread. and personal hygiene helped. Even though Tudors didn't bathe much, as we discussed earlier, bathing was considered medically dangerous. They did wash their hands before eating, did change their linen undergarments regularly, did try to keep themselves relatively clean. This helped. Not enough, but some. The truth is, Tudor medical technology was limited by fundamental gaps in knowledge. Without understanding microorganisms, you can't treat infection. Without understanding blood circulation, you can't perform advanced surgery. Without understanding chemistry, you can't develop effective drugs. The Tudors were working in the dark, trying treatments based on theory, tradition, and hope. Sometimes they got lucky. More often they didn't. But they tried. They observed. They experimented. They built the foundation that later physicians would build on. And slowly, incrementally, medicine improved. And here's the irony. While Tudor physicians were developing surgical tools and anatomical knowledge, while they were experimenting with mercury treatments and tree panning and tobacco smoke enemas, the most effective medical technology of the period wasn't medical at all. It wasn't a tool, wasn't a procedure, wasn't a treatment. It was a policy. A brutal, simple, devastatingly effective policy. Plague hits London. Not the first time, not the last time. But this outbreak is bad, really bad. By the time it ends, 20,000 people are dead. A quarter of London's population gone in months. The response is simple. Quarantine. If someone in your household gets plague, the entire household is locked in. A red cross is painted on your door. Guards are posted. No one leaves. For 40 days, whether you're sick or not. This is brutal. Families are trapped in houses with infected people, watching loved ones die, unable to escape, unable to seek help. If you weren't sick when the quarantine started, you probably would be by the time it ended. But from a public health perspective, it worked. Quarantine slowed the spread, prevented infected people from moving through the city, gave the outbreak time to burn out. This was Tudor disease control technology. Not medicine, not treatment, just containment, and it was remarkably effective. The Tudors also developed other public health measures. Plague orders that shut down theatres, markets, and other gathering places during outbreaks. Requirements that deaths be reported to parish officials. Bills of mortality that tracked deaths by parish and cause. This was early epidemiology, data collection to understand disease patterns. And it helped, not perfectly. Plague still killed thousands, but without these measures, it would have killed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Tudor public health technology also included sanitation regulations, rules about where waste could be dumped, requirements that butchers dispose of animal remains outside city limits, prohibitions against keeping pigs within city walls. These rules were often ignored, enforcement was spotty, but the fact that they existed shows an understanding that filth bred disease. Even without knowing about bacteria, the Tudors understood that clean environments were healthier. They also understood the importance of clean water. London had a system of conduits, pipes bringing fresh water from springs outside the city. The water was distributed through fountains where people could collect it. It wasn't perfect, the pipes leaked, the fountains were crowded, but it was better than drinking from the Thames, which was an open sewer. Some wealthy houses had private water supplies, lead pipes bringing water directly to the house. Yes, lead pipes, causing lead poisoning, but at least the water was cleaner than the alternative. Tudor cities were starting to understand infrastructure. That providing clean water, removing waste, and maintaining streets wasn't just convenience, it was survival. Disease control required civic investment, required planning, required collective action. This was new. Medieval cities had been organic, unplanned, growing without design. But Tudor cities were beginning to be managed, to be engineered, and this engineering extended to hospitals. The Tudors established hospitals for the sick poor. St. Bartholomew's, St. Thomas's, these weren't modern hospitals, more like hospices, places where people went to die with some comfort and dignity, but they provided care, food, warmth, basic nursing, and sometimes people recovered. The hospitals became centres of medical learning, places where physicians could observe diseases, try treatments, build knowledge. This is what Tudor medical technology really was. Not just tools and procedures, but systems, public health systems, information systems, care systems, ways of organising society to deal with disease. The tools were crude, the knowledge incomplete, but the systems worked imperfectly, brutally, but they worked. They kept cities functioning through plague outbreaks, kept the sick from spreading disease, kept society from collapsing. And that's what technology is, not just gadgets, but systems, ways of organising knowledge and resources to solve problems. The Tudors were building these systems, learning through trial and error, making mistakes, but slowly, incrementally, improving. Queen Elizabeth I is dying. She's the last Tudor monarch, the last of her line. With her death, an era ends. And what an era it was. The Tudors transformed England, from a minor European power to a global empire, from an agricultural economy to a commercial one, from medieval to modern. And technology was central to that transformation. The printing press spread ideas, the compass and astrolabe enabled exploration, the watermill powered industry, the ships carried trade, the tools built infrastructure. But Tudor technology was always complicated, always double-edged. It solved problems and created new ones. It enabled progress and caused suffering. It was brilliant and brutal. The astronomical clock at Hampton Court still ticks, still shows the universe spinning around Earth, still wrong about cosmology, but right about time. A perfect metaphor for Tudor technology. Sophisticated, but limited. Impressive, but flawed. The printing presses that spread knowledge also spread propaganda. The ships that explored the world also carried enslaved people. The tools that built palaces also built weapons. The medicines that sometimes healed often killed. This is what technology always is, power. And power can be used for anything, for creation or destruction, for helping or harming, for progress or oppression. The Tudors understood this. They embraced technology, invested in it, developed it. Not because they were idealistic, but because they were pragmatic. They wanted power, wanted wealth, wanted glory, and technology gave them the tools to get it. They succeeded. By 1603, England was powerful, wealthy, influential, a player on the world stage. And that success was built on technology, on innovation, on the willingness to try new things, to take risks, to push boundaries. But the cost was high. People died in experiments, died in accidents, died from technology that was supposed to help them. The lead in the makeup, the mercury in the medicine, the ships that sank, the guns that exploded, the buildings that collapsed. Tudor technology killed people, lots of people, but it also saved people, fed people, housed people, enabled people to build lives that would have been impossible without it. So, was it worth it? That's not a question with an easy answer. Because technology doesn't ask permission, doesn't wait for moral clarity. It just exists, and people use it, for good or ill. Often both. The Tudors didn't have the luxury of philosophical debates about technology. They lived in a world that was brutal, dangerous, unforgiving. They needed every advantage they could get, every tool, every innovation, every piece of knowledge. So they built clocks that tracked the cosmos, printed books that challenged authority, sailed ships that crossed oceans, ground grain with water wheels, fired guns that changed warfare, wore makeup that poisoned them, built houses that impressed guests, and tried desperately to control the chaos of existence. They didn't always succeed, often failed spectacularly, but they tried. And in trying, they created the foundation for the world we live in today. Because Tudor technology didn't end with the Tudors. It evolved, improved, built upon. The printing press became the newspaper. The compass became GPS. The watermill became the hydroelectric dam. The ship became the container ship. The gun became, well, guns are still guns. Some things don't change. But the spirit of Tudor innovation lives on. The willingness to experiment, to fail, to try again, to push boundaries even when it's dangerous. That's still how technology advances, still how progress happens. So tonight, when you're lying in bed with your temperature-controlled room and your indoor plumbing and your smartphone, remember the Tudors. Remember the people who built clocks with gears, who printed books with presses, who sailed oceans with compasses, who shaped the world with hammers and saws. Remember that technology is always complicated, always double-edged, always powerful and dangerous at the same time. And remember that the Tudors, for all their flaws, were brilliant, innovative, brave, and absolutely, completely out of their minds, which is exactly what it takes to change the world. Thanks for staying with me tonight. If you made it this far, leave a comment. Tell me which piece of Tudor technology surprised you most. The toilet that announced your business, the makeup that poisoned queens, the ships that leaked constantly, the clocks that predicted death. And if you want more deep dives into weird historical technology, subscribe, because we're just getting started. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more inventions to explore, so many more ways the past was stranger than you ever imagined. Now go get some sleep. Dream about astronomical clocks and watermills and printing presses. Dream about a world where going to the bathroom was a public event and wearing makeup could kill you. Dream about the Tudors and their wonderful, terrible, brilliant technology, and be grateful you live now, with antibiotics and anaesthesia and toilets that flush quietly. Because the Tudor period, it was amazing, it was transformative, it was the birth of the modern world, but you definitely wouldn't want to live there.